Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. From the Graphomania Podcast Network, I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I am Robbie Hurlocker. Today is going to be a slightly unique episode. It's a little different than what we intended to do this week to begin with, but we want to pitch a new style of episode that we're going to be bringing to you periodically from now on. We want to do a series called In Their Own Words.
And originally, back in August, we had recorded ourselves reading the Reynolds Pamphlet, and we got halfway through it. We were going to do this as a Patreon exclusive, but we thought a good way to kick off this new segment would be to share this with everyone on our main RSS feed.
That's right. So our original idea with In Their Own Words was to have a segment of this podcast dedicated to looking at the source material, the original documents written by Alexander Hamilton, the original documents written by Thomas Jefferson, and we would not just read them to you like we're about to do with the Reynolds Pamphlet, but we would also give you a little bit of commentary and context to see what is the legacy of the Federalist Papers. What is the legacy of the things that our heroes from this musical have written? And so in this episode, we're starting off with the Reynolds Pamphlet, and we've already dived into a lot of what the Reynolds Pamphlet means. If you want any reminder about that, you can go back now and listen to the Reynolds Pamphlet episode that we did earlier in Hamilton the Podcast.
Now, before we get to that, as a lot of you might know, we're finally getting the Hamilton mixtape.
Yay!
We're actually getting a volume 2 as well, but Lin-Manuel Miranda said we have to wait for volume 1 to be finished.
I don't know if I can wait for it.
Me neither.
But, oh my goodness, the tracks that have already been released for the Hamilton mixtape, My Shot featuring Busta Rhymes and others, my goodness, that was so good. I was ready to rise up. I was ready to absolutely take to the streets and have a revolution right then when I was listening to this guy rap about it. Oh my goodness, this is what my heart has wanted.
Yeah, and I love Sia and was super excited to hear her version of Satisfied that she does with Queen Latifah and Miguel.
Oh man, they're all so talented.
Yeah, I cannot wait to hear the rest of this thing.
It's going to be so good. Have you pre-ordered your copy yet?
Yes.
Of course.
So we're definitely going to be doing some type of episode over that when it comes out. I'm not sure what the format there will look like, but we want to talk about that when it comes out.
Yeah, I texted Vinton as soon as I heard My Shot, the very first one I listened to, and I said, hey, we're talking about this right away, right? Like, I have a lot of things. I have opinions. I want to say these. These are so good, and I cannot wait to hear all of your thoughts as you listen to the tracks, and hit us up at @GraphoCast on Twitter. I would love to hear your thoughts as you're going through this, because, man, it's like we got new Hamilton music all over again.
I'd be okay with a new Hamilton mixtape every 6 months.
I don't see why that shouldn't happen.
So be looking for our discussion on that sometime in December, most likely.
Hamilton news aside, let's move into the main event. In their own words, the Reynolds Pamphlet. We'll begin with the introduction we recorded when we originally thought this would just be a Patreon exclusive. I hope you enjoy it.
We mentioned on Hamilton the Podcast that we were thinking about reading this, and you guys said you wanted it, so we're here.
Yeah, we were going into this and we were researching it, and we love listening to audiobooks ourselves. And one of the things we noticed is that we couldn't find a quality audible version of this pamphlet. There are a ton of things that Alexander Hamilton wrote. He wrote like he was running out of time. He wrote nonstop. So there are a lot of things that just haven't made it into an audible format for us. So we decided that in case you are like us, and in addition to devouring your books, or instead of devouring books, you also enjoyed devouring audible media, we wanted to put this out there so that you could hear Alexander Hamilton's true words.
So if you enjoy this and you want to hear more, we think we'd like to record more. So drop us a note on Twitter @GraphoCast or email us contact@GraphoCast and let us know if you want more.
Exactly. We could read the correspondence between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton that was leading up to their duel. That could be a fun little series to do. There are lots of other things we can introduce if we wanted to read the True Farmers Refuted essays. We could go into those. There's no end to this. I guess there's an end because Alexander Hamilton passed away and he stopped writing at a certain point. But there's a lot to work with.
I like the idea of reading correspondence because then we can actually go back and forth as those different people.
That's right. So a quick note on how we're going to read this. Vinton and I have decided that we're just going to go every few paragraphs. We're going to trade off every 3 to 5 paragraphs. We'll just take turns reading through this. And so when you hear a drastic change in voice, it's not that we're suddenly struck with this weird throat condition. It's just we're changing voices.
There might be throat conditions as well. We apologize for that.
Now, we also apologize because we weren't born in the 1700s and we are not scholars of the 1700s. So there are words in these essays that we understand because of footnotes, but we may not be pronouncing them correctly.
That's right. Due to lack of audible versions of these type of things, some of these words I haven't ever even heard pronounced before. I've read them plenty of times, but I might have come up with my own way to pronounce them.
Right. I think we've all had those types of words. We're going through class and we suddenly are having to read aloud in front of everybody the thing that everybody knows what this word is, but I've never had to pronounce it. I remember watching a person read in front of our class one time, senior year of high school, and they were reading, and they got to the word segui, and they're like, "Are you trying to say Segway?" Oh, that's what that's spelled? Like, I've never seen it spelled or whatever. And so, yeah, we may pronounce things badly. Please be polite. Give us some grace. We're going to have some fun with this.
Without further ado, we present for you the Reynolds Pamphlet. The Graphomania Podcast Network presents the Reynolds Pamphlet, published in 1797, otherwise known as Observations on Certain Documents Contained in Numbers 5 and 6 of the History of the United States for the year 1796, in which the charge of speculation against Alexander Hamilton, late Secretary of the Treasury, is fully refuted. Written by Alexander Hamilton himself. Read from founders.archives.gov. Read by Hamilton the Podcast hosts, Vinton Bayne and Robbie Hurlocker.
The spirit of Jacobinism, if not an entirely new spirit, has at least been clothed with a more gigantic body and armed with more powerful weapons than it ever before possessed. It is perhaps not too much to say that it threatens more extensive and complicated mischiefs to the world than have hitherto flowed from the 3 great scourges of mankind: war, pestilence, and famine. To what point it will ultimately lead society, it is impossible for human foresight to pronounce. But there is just ground to apprehend that its progress may be marked with calamities of which the dreadful incidents of the French Revolution afford a very faint image. Incessantly busied in undermining all the props of public security and private happiness, it seems to threaten the political and moral world with a complete overthrow. A principal engine by which this spirit endeavors to accomplish its purposes is that of calumny. It is essential to its success that the influence of men of upright principles, disposed and able to resist its enterprises, shall be at all events destroyed. Not content with traducing their best efforts for the public good, with misrepresenting their purest motives, with inferring criminality from actions innocent and laudable, the most direct falsehoods are invented and propagated with undaunted effrontery and unrelenting perseverance. Lies, often detected and refuted, are still revived and repeated in the hope that the refutation may have been forgotten, or that the frequency and boldness of accusations may supply the place of truth and proof. The most profligate men are encouraged, probably bribed, certainly with patronage if not with money, to become informers and accusers, and when tales which their characters alone ought to discredit are refuted by evidence and facts which oblige the patrons of them to abandon their support, they still continue in corroding whispers to wear away the reputations which they could not directly subvert. If luckily for the conspirators against honest fame, any little foible or folly can be traced out in one whom they desire to persecute, it becomes at once in their hands a two-edged sword by which to wound the public character and stab the private felicity of the person. With such men, nothing is sacred. Even the peace of an unoffending and amiable wife is a welcome repast to their insatiate fury against the husband.
In the gratification of this baleful spirit, we not only hear the Jacobin newspapers continually ring with odious insinuations and charges against many of our most virtuous citizens, but not satisfied with this, a measure new in this country has been lately adopted to give greater efficacy to a system of defamation. Periodical pamphlets issue from the same presses, full freighted with misrepresentation and falsehood, artfully calculated to hold up the opponents of the faction to the jealousy and distrust of the present generation, and if possible to transmit their names with dishonor to posterity. Even the great and multiplied services, the tried and rarely equaled virtues of a Washington, can secure no exemption. How then can I, with pretensions every way inferior, expect to escape? And if truly this be, as every appearance indicates, a conspiracy of vice against virtue, ought I not rather be flattered that I have been so long and so peculiarly an object of persecution? Ought I to regret if there be anything about me so formidable to the faction as to have made me worthy to be distinguished by the plenitude of its rancor and venom? It is certain that I have had a pretty copious experience of its malignity. For the honor of human nature, it is to be hoped that the examples are not numerous of men so greatly calumniated and persecuted as I have been, with so little cause. I dare appeal to my immediate fellow citizens of whatever political party for the truth of the assertion that no man ever carried into public life a more unblemished pecuniary reputation than that which I undertook the office of Secretary of Treasury, a character marked by an indifference to the acquisition of property rather than an avidity for it.
With such a character, however natural it was to expect criticism and opposition as to the political principles which I might manifest or be supposed to entertain, as to the wisdom or expediency of the plans which I might propose, or as to the skill, care, or diligence with which the business of my department might be executed, it was not natural to expect, nor did I expect, that my fidelity or integrity in a pecuniary sense would ever be called into question. But on his head, a mortifying disappointment has been experienced. Without the slightest foundation, I have been repeatedly held up to the suspicions of the world as a man directed in his administration by the most sordid views, who did not scruple to sacrifice the public to his private interests, his duty and honor to the sinister accumulation of wealth. Merely because I retained an opinion once common to me and the most influential of those who opposed me, that the public debt ought to be provided for on the basis of the contract upon which it was created, I have been wickedly accused with wantonly increasing the public burden many millions in order to promote a stock-jobbing interest of myself and my friends. Merely because a member of the House of Representatives entertained an idea different from me as to the legal effect of appropriation laws and did not understand accounts, I was exposed to the imputation of having committed a deliberate and criminal violation of the laws and to the suspicion of being a defaulter for millions, so as to have been driven to the painful necessity of calling for a formal and solemn inquiry.
The inquiry took place. It was conducted by a committee of 15 members of the House of Representatives, a majority of them either my decided political enemies or inclined against me. Some of them the most active and intelligent of my opponents, without a single man who, being known to be friendly to me, possessed also such knowledge and experience of public affairs as would enable him to counteract injurious intrigues. Mr. Giles of Virginia, who had commenced the attack, was of the committee. The officers and books of the Treasury were examined. The transactions between the several banks and the Treasury were scrutinized. Even my private accounts with those institutions were laid open to the committee, and every possible facility given to the inquiry. The result was a complete demonstration that the suspicions which had been entertained were groundless. Those which had taken the fastest hold were that the public monies had been made subservient to loans, discounts, and accommodations to myself and friends. The committee, in reference to this point, reported thus. It appears from the affidavits of the cashier and several officers of the Bank of the United States and several of the directors, the cashier and other officers of the Bank of New York, that the Secretary of the Treasury never has either directly or indirectly for himself or any other person procured any discount or credit from either of the said banks upon the basis of any public moneys which at any time have been deposited therein under his direction, and the committee are satisfied that no moneys of the United States, whether before or after they have passed to the credit of the treasurer, have ever been directly or indirectly used for or applied to any purposes but those of the government, except so far as all moneys deposited in a bank are concerned in the general operation thereof.
The report, which I have always understood was unanimous, contains in other respects with considerable detail the materials of a complete exculpation. My enemies, finding no handle for their malice, abandoned their pursuit. Yet, unwilling to leave any ambiguity upon the point, when I determined to resign my office, I gave early previous notice of it to the House of Representatives for the declared purpose of affording an opportunity for legislative crimination if any ground for it had been discovered. Not the least step towards it was taken, for which I have a right to infer the universal conviction of the House that no cause existed, and to consider the result as a complete vindication. On another occasion, a worthless man by the name of Francis found encouragement to bring forward to the House of Representatives a formal charge against me of unfaithful conduct in office. A committee of the House was appointed to inquire, consisting in this case also partly of some of my most intelligent and active enemies. The issue was a unanimous exculpation of me, as will appear by the following extract from the Journals of the House of Representatives of the 19th of February, 1794.
The House resumed the consideration of the report of the committee to whom was referred the memorial of Andrew G. Francis, whereupon resolved that the reasons assigned by the Secretary of the Treasury for refusing payment of the warrants referred to in the memorial are fully sufficient to justify his conduct, and that in the whole course of this transaction, the Secretary and other officers of the Treasury have acted a meritorious part towards the public. Resolved that the charge exhibited in the memorial against the Secretary of Treasury relative to the purchase of the pension of Baron de Globuc is wholly illiberal and groundless.
Was it not to have been expected that these repeated demonstrations of the injustice of the accusations hazarded against me would have abashed the enterprise of my calumniators? However natural such an expectation may seem, it would betray an ignorance of the true character of the Jacobin system. It is a maxim deeply engrafted in that dark system that no character, however upright, is a match for constantly reiterated attacks, however false. It is well understood by its disciples that every calumny makes some proselytes and even retains some, since justification seldom circulates as rapidly and as widely as slander. The number of those who from doubt proceed to suspicion and thence to belief of imputed guilt is continually augmenting, and the public mind, fatigued at length with resistance to the calumnies which eternally assail it, is apt in the end to sit down with the opinion that a person so often accused cannot be entirely innocent. Relying upon this weakness in human nature, the Jacobin Scandal Club, though often defeated, constantly return to the charge. Old calumnies are served up afresh, and every pretext is seized to add to the catalogue. The person whom they seek to blacken, by dint of repeated strokes of their brush, becomes a demon in their own eyes, though he might be pure and bright as an angel, but for the daubing causes of the wizard painters.
Of all the vile attempts which have been made to injure my character, that which has been lately revived in numbers 5 and 6 of the history of the United States for 1796 is the most vile. This it will be impossible for any intelligent, I will not say candid, man to doubt, when he shall have accompanied me through the examination. I owe perhaps to my friends an apology for condescending to give a public explanation. A just pride with reluctance stoops to a formal vindication against so despicable a contrivance, and is inclined rather to oppose to it the uniform evidence of an upright character. This would be my conduct on the present occasion. Did not the tale seem to derive a sanction from the names of 3 men of some weight and consequence in society? A circumstance which I trust will excuse me for paying attention to a slander that without this prop would defeat itself by intrinsic circumstances of absurdity and malice. The charge against me is a connection with one James Reynolds for purposes of improper pecuniary speculation. My real crime is an amorous connection with his wife, for a considerable time with his privity and connivance, if not originally brought on by a combination between the husband and wife with a design to extort money from me. This confession is not made without a blush. I cannot be the apologist of any vice because the ardor of passion may have made it mine. I can never cease to condemn myself for the pang which it may inflict in the bosom eminently entitled to all my gratitude, fidelity, and love. But that bosom will approve that even at so great an expense I should effectually wipe away a more serious stain from my name, which it cherishes with no less elevation than tenderness. The public, too, will, I trust, excuse the confession. The necessity of it to my defense against a more heinous charge could alone have extorted from me so painful an indecorum. Before I proceed to an exhibition of the positive proof which repels the charge, I shall analyze the documents from which it is deduced, and I am mistaken if with discerning and candid minds more would be necessary. But I desire to obviate the suspicions of the most suspicious.
The first reflection which occurs on a perusal of the documents is that it is morally impossible I should have been foolish as well as depraved enough to employ so vile an instrument as Reynolds for such insignificant ends as are indicated by the different parts of the story itself. My enemies, to be sure, have kindly portrayed me as another Chartres on the score of moral principle, but they have been ever bountiful in ascribing to me talents. It has suited their purposes to exaggerate such as I may possess, and to attribute to them an influence to which they are not entitled. But the present accusation imputes to me as much folly as wickedness. All the documents show, and it is otherwise matter of notoriety, that Reynolds was an obscure, unimportant, and profligate man. Nothing could be more weak, because nothing could be more unsafe than to make use of such an instrument. To use him, too, without any intermediate agent more worthy of confidence who might keep me out of sight, to write him numerous letters recording the objects of the improper connection, for this is pretended, and the letters were afterward burnt at my request, to unbosom myself to him with a prodigality of confidence, by very unnecessarily telling him, as he alleges, of a connection in speculation between myself and Mr. Dewar. It is very extraordinary if the head of the money department of a country, being unprincipled enough to sacrifice his trust and his integrity, could not have contrived objects of profit sufficiently large to have engaged the cooperation of men of far greater importance than Reynolds, and with whom there could have been due safety, and should have been driven to the necessity of unkennelling such a reptile to be the instrument of his cupidity.
But moreover, the scale of the concern with Reynolds, such as it is presented, is contemptibly narrow for a rapacious, speculating Secretary of the Treasury. Clingman, Reynolds, and his wife were manifestly in very close confidence with each other. It seems there was a free communication of secrets. Yet in clubbing their different items of information as to the supplies of money which Reynolds received from me, what do they amount to? Klingman states that Mrs. Reynolds told him that a certain time her husband had received from me upwards of $1,100. A note is produced which shows that at one time $50 were sent to him. And another note is produced by which, and the information of Reynolds himself through Klingman, it appears that at another time $300 were asked and refused. Another sum of $200 is spoken of by Klingman as having been furnished to Reynolds at some other time. What a scale of speculation is this for the head of a public treasury, for one who in the very publication that brings forward the charge is represented as having procured to be funded at 40 millions, a debt which ought to have been discharged at 10 or 15 millions for the criminal purpose of enriching himself and his friends. He must have been a clumsy knave if he did not secure enough of this excess of 25 or 30 millions to have taken away all inducement to risk his character in such bad hands and in so huckstering a way, or to have enabled him, if he did employ such an agent, to do it with more means and to better purpose. It is curious that this rapacious secretary should at one time have furnished his speculating agent with the paltry sum of $50, at another have refused him the inconsiderable sum of $300, declaring upon his honor that it was not in his power to furnish it. This declaration was true or not. If the last, the refusal ill comports with the idea of a speculating connection. If the first, it is very singular that the head of the treasury, engaged without scruple in schemes of profit, should have been destitute of so small a sum. But if we suppose this officer to be living upon an inadequate salary, without any collateral pursuits of gain, the appearance then are simple and intelligible enough, applying to them the true key.
It appears that Reynolds and Klingman were detected by the then Comptroller of the Treasury in the odious crime of suborning a witness to commit perjury for the purpose of obtaining letters of administration on the estate of a person who was living in order to receive a small sum of money due to him from the Treasury. It is certainly extraordinary that the confidential agent of the head of that department should have been in circumstances to induce a resort to so miserable an expedient. It is odd, if there was a speculating connection, that it was not more profitable both to the secretary and to his agent than are indicated by the circumstances disclosed. It is also a remarkable and very instructive fact that notwithstanding the great confidence and intimacy which subsisted between Klingman, Reynolds, and his wife, and which continued till after the period of the liberation of the two former from the prosecution against them, neither of them has ever specified the objects of the pretended connection in speculation between Reynolds and me. The pretext that the letters which contained the evidence were destroyed is no answer. They could not have been forgotten, and might have been disclosed from memory. The total omission of this could only have proceeded from the consideration that detail might have led to detection. The destruction of letters, besides, is a fiction, which is refuted not only by the general improbability that I should put myself upon paper with so despicable a person on a subject which might expose me to infamy, but by the evidence of extreme caution on my part in this particular, resulting from the laconic and disguised forms of the notes which are produced. They prove incontestably that there was an unwillingness to trust Reynolds with my handwriting. The true reason was that I apprehended he might make use of it to impress upon others the belief of some pecuniary connection with me, and besides implicating my character, might render it the engine of a false credit, or turn it to some other sinister use. Hence the disguise. For my conduct in admitting at once and without hesitation that the notes were from me proves that it was never my intention, by the expedient of disguising my hand, to shelter myself from any serious inquiry. The accusation against me was never heard of till Klingman and Reynolds were under prosecution by the Treasury for an infamous crime. It will be seen by the document number 1A that during the endeavors of Klingman to obtain relief through the interposition of Mr. Muhlenberg, he made to the latter the communication of my pretended criminality. It will be further seen by document number 2A that Reynolds had, while in prison, conveyed to the ears of Messrs. Monroe and Venerable that he could give intelligence of my being concerned in speculation, and that he also supposed that he was kept in prison by a design on my part to oppress him and drive him away. And by his letter to Clingman on the 13th of December, after he was released from prison, it also appears that he was actuated by a spirit of revenge against me, for he declares that he will have satisfaction from me at all events, adding, as addressed to Clingman, "And you only I trust."
3 important inferences flow from these circumstances. 1, that the accusation against me was an auxiliary to the efforts of Clingman and Reynolds to get released from a disgraceful prosecution. Another, that there was a vindictive spirit against me, at least on the part of Reynolds. The third, that he confided in Clingman as a coadjutor in the plan of vengeance. These circumstances, according to every estimate of the credit due to accusers, ought to destroy their testimony. To what credit are persons entitled who, in telling a story, are governed by the double motive of escaping from disgrace and punishment and of gratifying revenge? As to Mrs. Reynolds, if she was not an accomplice, as it is too probable she was, her situation would naturally subject her to the will of her husband. But enough besides will appear in the sequel to show that her testimony merits no attention. The letter which has been just cited deserves a more particular attention. As it was produced by Clingman, there is a chasm of 3 lines, which lines are manifestly essential to explain the sense. It may be inferred from the context that these deficient lines would unfold the cause of the resentment which is expressed. 'Twas from them that might have been learnt the true nature of the transaction. The expunging of them is a violent presumption that they would have contradicted the purpose for which the letter was produced. A witness offering such a mutilated piece discredits himself. The mutilation is alone satisfactory proof of contrivance and imposition. The manner of accounting for it is frivolous. The words of the letter are strong. Satisfaction is to be had at all events, per fas et nefas. And Clingman is the chosen confidential agent of the laudable plan of vengeance. It must be confessed, he was not wanting in his part. So that was part 1 of the Reynolds Pamphlet. We'll be returning next week with part 2.
And some closing thoughts on what this whole mess of a document really is saying.
As always, you can get in contact with us, contact@graphocast.com, on Twitter, @graphocast. Check out our Patreon, patreon.com/graphocast, to support the Graphomania Podcast Network and get exclusives like the reading of the Reynolds Pamphlet without the intros and outros, and as one whole part, not divided into 2 episodes. Signing off until next week, I'm Vinton Bayne, @FleshEater on Twitter.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker. You can find me at Alpha Knight.
This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, graphocast.com. Follow us on Twitter @graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.